I'm gonna edit that, so if
Yeah, no worries.
there's nothing. So I'm with Randy Cramer, the famous Randy Cramer who said went to Mars and back to Earth with the
And a few other places, but that's beside the point.
with the Earth's Defense Force. Would you please explain us, for people that don't know you at all, like a kind of wrap up of your history, when it begins, and also when you first start to remember stuff?
Sure. I'll do my best to try and take a full career worth of information and cram it down into a teeny little synopsis. So, covert military space programs were started up pretty much right out of the 1940s, 1950s, out of the military intelligence program of the United States after the retrieval of crashed UFOs, unidentified aerial phenomenon, with machinery that we could reverse engineer and start building our own spaceships, as well as with some assistance that we were getting from other extraterrestrial engineers. So,
was it part of the Majestic 12 program, or?
Oh, okay. So MJ-12, or the Majestic 12 program, is essentially a policy-setting committee. So if you think of a pyramid with the MJ-12 committee at the top setting policy, and underneath them is about 200 people in about 20 different groups called the Special Study Groups, or the SSGs. The Special Study Groups are the actual managers and hands-on controllers of these programs. They report to the committee tells them, what they want to do policy-wise, and the committee is supposed to govern the Special Study Groups and the Special Study Groups' management of covert military space program activities. Now, the problem is that didn't go like it was intended. That corruption within the Special Study Groups started to become rampant, and members of the SSGs were serving their own interests. They were essentially making themselves rich, making their friends rich, making industrialist friends rich, not really keeping in mind with the overall goal of advancing technology into society so that we can one day have a moment where we can admit that we have extraterrestrial neighbors, brothers and sisters who have been visiting us, and that we can exchange information, philosophy, and technology with. So that's where the sort of mess with this whole thing begins, is a policy setting group, a management organization underneath that policy setting group, which became corrupt and working for itself. So the Special Study Groups weren't necessarily telling MJ-12 everything, nor were they following all of MJ-12's orders. So the MJ-12 committee has always been this, top dog policy setting committee, but they're not in charge because they don't literally have their control on every single person and every single program. So a manager or a director of a program is essentially like God unto nothing, because they're totally in control of an apparatus that they really don't technically have to answer to anyone.
So they lost control.
Yeah, so they lost control. So what happened when in the early 1950s, about late 1953 time frame, President Dwight Eisenhower met with an extraterrestrial ambassador, or 2 or 3 times, depending on what stories you want to believe, and after that decided that he wasn't getting all the information. So he told his Secretary of Defense at the time to go over and tell the MJ-12 guys that he wanted a report on his desk next week, or he was going to, get angry about it. And his Secretary of Defense went over, asked them for a report. They sent him over a whitewashed report that he knew was garbage. And he said, look, you tell them that I want the truth, or I'm going to get the 1st Army Division, I'm going to kick in the doors at S4 and take the bodies and take the ships, and I'm just going to take everything. So they, started to try and give him some more accurate information in order to comply, but they still weren't telling him everything. So Eisenhower knew that he needed a military intelligence organization that would be beholden to the Constitution of the United States and would be beholden to the law. So the creation of United States Marine Corps Special Section happened in sort of late 1953, early 1954. So about 15 or 16 years later, when we're working on the genetic augmentation programs, is where I come in. So in the late 1960s, United States Marine Corps Special Section is working on these augmented genetic programs to genetically augment soldiers to make them stronger, smarter, faster. Again, being assisted by extraterrestrial scientists and engineers in the process. So sometime in the late 1960s, they decide they're going to build soldiers from the ground up. That instead of trying to take a toddler or an adult and using gene therapy to sort of alter the genes that they already have, that they're going to start from the very ground up, and they're going to start with fertilized cells. They're going to pull out the DNA sequences. They're going to pluck everything out that they want out, put in DNA sequences that they want, which is pretty much codons from extraterrestrial DNA sets, again, so these soldiers are smarter, faster, and stronger.
Were they having any help from people from elsewhere?
Yes, we were absolutely being assisted in this process by extraterrestrial scientists and engineers who were helping us get through this process. Without their help, it would have taken us a decade longer, at least, to probably try and figure it out. But because we had their assistance, we were able to get through the process pretty quickly. So
why would they help us? Because they got to gain something from that.
Well, you have many different species out there who have different agendas. And obviously some species see us as something that can be profited from. They can make some profit. They can gain something from us. There are other species who simply believe that the universe is served by evolution, and that if they go around to other species and other systems and they help other species and other systems to evolve, then they're doing the great work of the universe by helping the universe evolve one planet at a time. So there are advanced species who think altruistically, in the sense that we can help this species, we can give them something, they can make something of themselves. We don't necessarily have to get anything from it other than by helping the species evolve, we're guaranteeing that this isn't a species that turns bad. Because a species that you're not guiding can turn bad. And a species that can turn bad, one of two things can happen. They can either destroy themselves, no big deal. Like it's an unfortunate thing, but if a species destroys their own planet, destroys themselves, that's an option. And at least it doesn't bleed out to the rest of the universe if they destroy themselves. Or they can hang on long enough to get spacefaring technology, and then they can start to take it out to the rest of the universe, and then they become a threat. So in the sense of what do they gain by helping us, they gain somewhere down in the future not having another potential threat to deal with. So in the sense of what do they gain out of it, they gain a more peaceful universe that they don't have to regulate.
They gain an ally.
Well, they gain an ally, but they also gain a universe that has less problems to deal with. So if you help a species evolve, then that's not going to be a problem necessarily in the future because you've helped them evolve. If you don't help a species evolve, maybe they're going to become a problem, and then when they're big and they're monstrous and militaristic and destroying planet after planet, then you've got a problem.
What about the deep underground bases? Because, I think there are many in the U.S.
Hundreds.
Hundreds. And all over the world.
Thousands around the world.
So, and I've heard stories about stuff going on down there that weren't really funny, neither pretty stuff,
No. One of the things that my superiors have asked me to come publicly to talk about this for is sort of two main reasons. One, we want to encourage people to think about a better future. We want to get the technologies released that can make a better world. There are these positive things that we can do with this information and this technology, and that's what we're trying to do. The other thing that we're trying to bring some attention to is there are some high crimes and misdemeanors going on here. So there are programs in which human beings are used as slaves, as just raw materials, in some cases as food. We don't believe that any of these things serve us as a civilization.
For a liquid protein to do clones?
That's also an option. I mean, there's a long list of high crimes and misdemeanors that certain rogue agencies and certain departments are responsible for. And one of the things that we would like to have happen by bringing sunshine to all of this, by bringing awareness and enlightenment to the fact that these things are happening, is to lighten up the shadowy parts so that some of these terrible, horrible things that are continuing under the shadow of darkness can't happen anymore. So again, it's a sort of a twofold purpose here. We want to talk about what's positive, what we can do, what future we can have that's amazing. We also need to talk about the terrible, horrible things that are being done that need to stop. And some of the ways in which we treat other human beings in order to get the things that we think that we need to accomplish are done so by violating, long lists of human rights. And we don't think that that's the way that we should do this. Not only do we not think that's the way that we should do this, we think that the extraterrestrial species that we have communicated with, which are intelligent and enlightened, would also encourage us that a path continuing along this will harm our own evolution. So if we look at it that way, then we have to look at some of the things that we're doing right now and realize that we have to stop them, or in 100 years or 200 years, they're going to hamper our own evolution as a species, and that's dumb. Like, we don't want to hamper our own evolution.
And what about you? Can you just tell us about what you
So I got started trying to take this overarching picture of what's going on. So late 1960 time frame, United States Marine Corps Special Section starts genetically augmenting soldiers to create smarter, faster, stronger, better people. So I was genetically engineered from the ground up, implanted by genetic sample from my mother, genetic sample from my father, mixed together with an extraterrestrial sets of the codons of DNA in the places that they wanted to mix them in. Then I was reimplanted back into my biological mother, born, raised in a normal working class American family while being trained on a regular basis for a time when I was about 17 years old, when I was sent onto a tour of duty, which was...
But before that, can you...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Where am I getting ahead? Where am I missing?
Before you left.
Right.
So you had a little training.
Okay, so genetically engineered from the ground up. Started training as a toddler. So they started the programming and the training at about 3 or 4 years old. So we were working with other kids on training programs that were... I mean, when we're young, they're basically training programs that are like games, your sort of games, sports, activities which are centered around a group goal, so that you've got a bunch of 4 or 5 year olds that you're really trying to get them to accomplish a singular specific goal in a tactical or strategical environment. Again, most of these are like games. They're not war scenarios, they're not violent scenarios at that age, they're just training scenarios that are, again, mostly like games. It's not until you get a little older that it starts to get violent, and the hand-to-hand combat and the weapons training comes in. Keep in mind
around
that
what age?
I was, okay, so when we're like 7, 8 years old, little kids, so we're given these little child-sized submachine guns, child-sized rifles, child-sized pistols, so they fit into our hands, right? So that we can practice with them at that age. And then as we get older, we're given, more and more bigger weapons to adapt to the physiological body size until we're about early teens, 14, 15 years old, and then they're giving you full adult-size weapons. But when we're toddlers, when we're adolescents, we're getting child-sized submachine guns, child-sized pistols, child-sized swords, child-sized spears, child-sized weapons that we can use. And we're trained in hand-to-hand combat, small arms combat, tactical and strategical combat out of the military handbooks at a very, very young age. So by the time we're ready for deployment at 17 years old, we've had more than 15 years worth of training. Most soldiers, when they go into combat for the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, get 10 weeks, 12 weeks, maybe 16 weeks at the most of training. We get 15 years of training before we're sent on a deployment. So we're very well prepared for the environments that we're going into, which are exotic environments, other worlds, extraterrestrial environments.
Were you prepared also for these new kind of environment?
Absolutely. By the time we're in our early teens, we're practicing in what are traditionally called exotic environments. And exotic environments are these large underground facility what do I want to call them? They're essentially a large underground. Think of something the size of a football stadium that's underground that can be altered to look like a half-destroyed urban environment, with buildings that are half crumbled. It can look like a rural environment. It could look like a forested environment. It could look like a wilderness environment on another world with plants and life forms that you've never seen before. They start introducing exotic targets, which at first are robotic, but then they start using biological targets, which I presume these are genetically engineered targets, but I honestly don't know where they get them or where they got them from. But in our early teens,
they might have been real ones.
They might have been real. I honestly don't know. I mean, to be honest, as a person, to think about who or what I may have killed in the past, it would make me very uncomfortable to think about that scenario in certain ways, and it makes me way more comfortable to think that they're just genetically engineered, lab materials.
Were they armed?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, with in some cases, pretty advanced weaponry, plasma rifles, directed energy weapons, rail guns. Yeah. I mean, psionic attacks. Mental weaponry. I mean, it was very sophisticated. But we were adapted to these exotic environments early, because it's really important to understand that what happens when you encounter let's just call it a strange scenario. Your brain does two things. Your frontal lobe starts to think about it, and it starts to process it as ideas, and it starts to think, how do I think about this? What do I feel about that? And then your frontal lobe concocts some way that you can process or appreciate or live with that information, and then you come to a place of what you can accept as real based on what your frontal lobe does, and that takes about 3 seconds for your frontal lobe to do that. Well, your amygdala, in about a nanosecond, is actually making a decision before that, and it's making a life or death decision. So what a lot of people, when they say in their mind, oh, I'd love to meet an alien, that would be the coolest thing ever. Not necessarily. You think that. You think it would be awesome because in this part of your frontal lobe, you think that would be really cool and you think that that would work out well. Well, if you're standing in front of a biological being that's not human, I guarantee your amygdala is going to react first. And if you're not conditioned to deal with that, you're going to panic. And if you panic, the first thing you're likely to do is not shoot straight, not shoot at the enemy, potentially hit a friendly and end up with a friendly fire situation, or in some cases, when regular Army, regular Marine Corps, regular military soldiers have encountered extraterrestrial beings or have had to deal with these scenarios, they break down. Some of them just break down and have nervous breakdowns. Some of them turn their weapons on themselves and shoot themselves in the head because they can't deal with it.
Is that happened in Roswell? I think that there are some the military that were there.
It's happened so many times. It's why we decided we needed to have special trained military personnel to deal with this, because standard military personnel were losing their shit. They were just cracking up and breaking. And again, in some cases, harming or shooting other soldiers or harming or shooting themselves. It was very tragic. So while some people may think, oh yeah, that would be awesome, I'd love to see an alien. Up here, yeah. In your frontal lobe, yeah, you do. Yeah, but in your amygdala, whoa, not necessarily. Your amygdala might panic and you might freak out. And when your amygdala panics, you go into a mental, emotional, physiological state that's difficult to control if you're not military trained, right? I mean, you start to go into panic. You want to run, you want to hide, you want to attack things that you think are a threat to you. Military training allows you to take all of those responses, curb them into something that's not reactive so that you can think about what you're doing instead of react to it from the amygdala. So we were trained especially to deal with that. Now, I'm not saying that the first time that I dealt with a real extraterrestrial being that I still wasn't in a state of shock.
Can you talk about it?
Well, I mean, we were acclimated to it in such a way so that the first time that I experienced extraterrestrial beings in a combat scenario, I wasn't shocked or surprised, but I was still in a state of shock as to, oh, this has never happened before. I've never experienced this before. I mean, this, that kind of shock comes into your brain. But because I was acclimated to it, I was like, okay, what do I do? I mean, my frontal lobe was able to go, okay, and my amygdala was going, but my frontal lobe was like, no, it's okay, we got this. We know what's going on. I understand what's happening here. But in the case of being in the MDF, which is the Mars Defense Force, which would have been the first time that I really engaged in large-scale combat with an alien species, so in this suit, in this exosuit, there's a pack.
Where was that?
On Mars. In
Okay.
Northern part of the map. I mean, I often describe where the station we were located is like the equivalent of Alaska on the map. So it was a very high northerly position that wasn't quite at the pole, but it wasn't at the equator either. So it was very cold. The air was very thin. But in the suit that we're wearing, which is an exosuit environment suit, so it's able to process water, oxygen, and so forth. Now you have a breathable atmosphere on Mars, but it's thin. So you can't run a marathon and you can't get in a wrestling match with someone without getting exhausted. So you have to have an environment suit to feed you more oxygen so that you can function in a fighting scenario. But there is oxygen that's breathable. The exosuit itself is also hydraulically powered so that you can jump farther, lift larger objects, essentially makes you even...
What about the gravity up there?
Oh, the gravity is about just over 0.4 Gs. So you've got less than half of Earth gravity there. So not only do you have this exosuit that's giving you this extra burst of strength, but you have half the gravity holding you down. So in an MDF exosuit, I could, in a single leap, probably clear a 2-story building. I couldn't do that here on Earth because of the 1G gravity, but in 0.42 or whatever it is, oh yeah, I could totally do that in 0.42. So, but in the exosuit, there's a pack that is filled with a drug, or a cocktail, really, a performance drug cocktail. And before you're going into combat, they trigger the stim pack and it injects a performance drug cocktail into your leg, and then your veins are filled with a performance drug cocktail that makes you angry, fearless, and not thinking about any of the consequences of harm to yourself. So with the drug cocktail, any notions of fear, any notions of not being prepared, any notions of being overwhelmed by this scenario is deleted because of biochemistry. Chemistry takes over, your brain becomes aggressive, violent, and fearless. And all I can say is that with that combination of things, violent, aggressive, and fearless, is a powerful combination. If you can turn a person violent, aggressive, and fearless, there's a lot that person can accomplish. So the combination of the technology and the drug cocktail made it so that we would perform at high levels of violence and aggression against any opponent or enemy. So the first time I experienced this, I was shocked, I was surprised, I was terrified, and then the drug shot into my leg, and then all of a sudden I was not afraid, I was angry, and I was aggressive, and I jumped down into the fray head first. And my first interaction with another extraterrestrial being was putting my boot in his face because I was on drugs and we were fighting. And
so who are they?
Oh, indigenous reptiles. Indigenous reptoids. So
how tall?
Anywhere, I'd say they average. So the shorter ones can be 5.5 feet tall, but the big ones can be upwards of about 7.5, almost 8 feet tall. They're big. They're really big. The big ones are big.
Okay.
Yeah, big, muscly, strong. They have a double circulatory system. So they have 2 hearts. One heart manages a circulatory system that is central to the torso and the internal organs. The other heart pumps a circulatory system that's to the extremities, to the arms and the legs. So you can blow holes in their arms and legs, lose blood pressure in the external system, have one heart fail, but the other heart pumping the internal organs will still function, and they'll still keep going. They'll still keep fighting. So you want to talk about a formidable enemy that wouldn't stop unless you aimed for the middle, unless you hit them in the center, in the torso. So if you're just shooting at extremities, they'll just keep coming, but you got to go for, you basically had to hit them in a way that they would lose blood pressure in both circulatory systems before they drop. So that's a fierce enemy. That's a fierce enemy.
Were they armed also? Were they armed?
They preferred hand-to-hand combat, so they had hand-to-hand weapons, melee weapons, swords, spears. But when I use words like sword and spear, doesn't really exactly describe the tools that they used. That's the best description that I can give, given what we understand as Terrans, as Earthlings here, on the tools that we have used to describe something that someone else uses that's similar. I honestly have had trouble even trying to figure out how to draw these things and come up with, like, to try and explain to them. The best thing that I could say to describe is that it was facing an enemy holding savage weapons. I don't know how else to describe it, but it was these are savage weapons. A lot of damage is done by these weapons, a lot of blood, a lot of tearing and ripping. So they're not exactly like clean-bladed weapons, but they're similar. So when I say sword-like, spear-like, halberd-like, people can use their imagination however they want, but even I have a difficult time trying to describe exactly what those things look like.
So where did the conflict start? You know, because were the enemies from from far away? I mean, in time, or do you know any about, you know?
Well, I know that when I came along to the scene, the war that had been going on there had been going on for some time, so for some number of years. So it wasn't like I came in at the beginning. I came in the middle when this was already underway. My understanding is that we entered into what was already a territorial dispute among native species. And we established ourselves at a geographical location that was such that was adjacent to the geographical territory of other species, so that we kind of instantly inserted ourselves into a territorial conflict where we were defending territory and pushing up against other territory of other local indigenous species.
Around what time?
This would have been between about 1987 and, what would that be, about 2004?
Okay.
So, about that. Yeah, so there were indigenous reptiles, indigenous insectoids that we would conflict with on a regular basis, and then after we'd been there for it was almost 5 years, I think, there was a draconian invasion where the draconians, which are a reptilian species, the alpha draconians, people are very familiar with them usually. They're more alligator or crocodile-like, if you're trying to describe what they look like as an evolved species or from what sort of type of lizard or reptile that they're from. The indigenous reptoids from Mars were way more like a rock lizard, so they're not like this alligator crocodile type. They don't have this long snout. They're not this dark green skin. They were sandy colors, red colors, with patterns that were black, gold, red. They were kind of like a rock lizard. So they're very different reptilian species, to make that perfectly clear. In fact, I want to point this out. I have heard more than one person say, well, you know, they're reptiles, so they're bad, or reptiles are bad species, or, well, these are invasive species and they're reptiles because reptiles are all evil. Bullshit, pardon my French. As we say in America, it's speciesism to say that. It is speciesism to say that all reptiles are bad, or that all mammals are good, or that all amphibians are overeaters, or that, I mean, these are all speciesist things that are not necessarily true at all. So a reptile is not bad because it's a reptile, nor is a mammal good because it's a mammal, nor is a cetacean good because it's a cetacean. You have different species, and there are all kinds of different good, bad, light, dark that come in those shapes and those flavors. So
like us.
yeah, exactly. As one very wise person once said, look, you can't look at a spaceship up there as being a this or that. They're people. And people are different. People have individual thoughts, individual ideas, individual agendas, and that is the same thing true of a spaceship of other extraterrestrial beings. They're people.
Do you happen to fight with other species?
Sometimes. Well, so when we were in the MDF, it was mostly these indigenous reptoids and indigenous insectoids. After my 17 plus years in the MDF, I was given a promotion, got to go to flight school, was part of an air wing on the EDF SS Nautilus, which stands for Earth Defense Force Starship Nautilus. It's about a mile long. It's essentially an aircraft carrier in space that has a bunch of fighters on it, so it was a pilot and an air wing. Mostly our job there was to just scare people away that came into the solar system. I used to call it glorified guard dog duty. So if someone came into the system, we'd bark and chase them away.
When did it start? I mean, the Earth Defense Force.
I'm not sure when the origination of it was, but it would have been in the late 60s or early 1970s, somewhere in about that time frame. Okay. Probably around 1970-71, right after the moon landing.
Who runs it?
Well, it's a conglomeration of military space forces from many different countries. So it's dominated by the Americans and the Russians, because before the Russians were the Russians, when they were the Soviets, they were actually they were the other country along with the US back in the 50s and the 60s that was spending gargantuan amounts of money to solve these problems. So we have a black budget in the US where we say, oh, we're spending $700 on a hammer. We're not spending $700 on a hammer, right? We're spending $895 on a hammer, and that other, $602 goes to something else. It is being used for something else. So we've done that. The Soviets, when it was the Soviets, were doing the same thing, and so when the Soviet Union fell and became the Russians, they were still one of the strongest members of the covert military space program. But you have essentially the members of the G20 countries that participate. The G7 countries are the primary participants because they have the money and the space program to do it. France just spent a bunch of money to boost its space program. India just sent a probe to the moon that apparently there was some problems with, and there was a crash, and so it didn't successfully land. But they had a successful launch. They got it to orbit properly. They demonstrated that their space program can function. So I don't say that they failed just because that the probe didn't successfully land. I think they succeeded 95% of what they tried to do, and the last 5% that they attempted didn't work out right. From the looks of it, and there's a picture I saw of the lander, it was supposed to be top up